It started as an offhand remark, one of those comments made in passing, without much thought but heavy with unspoken meaning. He wasn't a cruel man, not intentionally anyway. He loved his wife in his own way, though years of routine and quiet expectations had settled between them. One evening, while they were clearing the dinner table, he looked at her, his voice light but edged with something else. "You know," he said, glancing at a travel ad on the TV, "maybe a vacation would help you lose some weight. Get you feeling better about yourself." It wasn't the first time he'd hinted at this, the subtle nudges about gym memberships, the way his eyes lingered a second too long on slimmer women passing by when they were out. He didn't mean harm, or so he believed. In his mind, he was encouraging her, pushing her toward what he thought would make her happier, healthier. But in reality, his words carried the weight of generations of expectations that a woman's worth, even now, was still so tightly wound around her appearance. The truth is, society had always whispered this message, especially where they lived. In their part of the world, beauty and size were currency, measured in hushed gossip and loud compliments. Families gathered at weddings to critique the bride's figure before they admired her dress. Mothers told their daughters to eat well, but not too much, because who will marry you otherwise? It wasn't said out of malice. It was tradition, a belief handed down like an heirloom, polished and repeated until it felt like truth. Her husband wasn't immune to these ideas. He was a man shaped by his environment, by the way his own father had spoken about his mother, the way his friends spoke about their wives over drinks. He admired his wife, yes, her resilience, her kindness, but he couldn't untangle those feelings from the societal script that told him she should look a certain way too. They weren't young anymore. The world they grew up in wasn't the one their children now inhabited. His daughter scrolled through Instagram, watching influencers preach self-love and body positivity, messages that clashed with the advice her mother had once given her: wear black. It's slimming. The gap between generations was wide and growing wider. He didn't quite understand it, didn't know how to bridge it. His wife, though, stood with one foot in each world, raised by the old ways but watching the new ones rise around her. She tried to balance it all, to be the loving wife, the supportive mother, the woman who didn't let the world's opinions dictate her worth. But that balance came at a cost. She remembered her mother's voice, soft but firm, warning her not to eat too many sweets as a girl. "Men like women who take care of themselves," she'd said, though take care was never about health, it was code for thin. Even now, years later, those words stuck to her ribs more than the weight ever had. Her mother had meant well, just as her husband did now. That was the painful part. The people who loved her most were the ones who made her feel the smallest. So when he said those words, "a vacation might help you lose weight," he didn't see the flicker in her eyes, the quiet snap of something inside her. He didn't realize it wasn't just his voice she heard. It was every voice. The aunties at weddings, the magazine covers in grocery stores, the younger women who didn't yet carry the weight of years and expectations. It was all of them, condensed into a single, casual suggestion. He thought he was helping. He didn't see that, this time, he had become one more voice in the crowd telling her she wasn't enough. Not yet. Not as she was. For a moment, she stood there, dish towel in hand, watching him flip through TV channels, unaware of what he'd really said, what she'd really heard. She wasn't angry, not yet. The anger would come later. For now, there was only that hollow feeling, the one she knew too well, the one that whispered maybe they were right. Maybe she would be happier if she were smaller, if she took up less space. But somewhere, buried beneath the doubt and the years of conditioning, another voice stirred. A quieter one. Her own. And it wasn't asking how much weight she should lose. It was asking something else entirely. Why did she have to change at all? ****. The plane ride was quieter than she expected. Not the hum of the engines or the murmured conversations around her, those were just background noise. The real quiet was inside her. It wasn't the anxious, restless kind that came from second-guessing herself. No, this quiet felt different. It felt like the moment before the sun rises, still and full of possibility. For the first time in what felt like years, she wasn't thinking about who needed what from her. She wasn't a wife planning meals, a mother organizing school schedules, or a woman wondering how she looked in her clothes. She was just a person on a plane, going somewhere new, and for the first time, that felt like enough. When she landed, the air felt different too. Warmer, brighter, though she wasn't sure if it was the weather or the weight she'd left behind. She wasn't entirely sure what she expected to feel when she got off the plane. Fear? Guilt? Loneliness? None of those showed up. Instead, she felt something else, light. She didn't know anyone here. No one knew her name, her story, or the size of her jeans. It was freeing in a way she hadn't anticipated. She didn't have to be anyone but herself, no one's wife, no one's mother, no one's disappointment. Just her. That first day, she walked without a plan. She let the streets guide her, turning corners simply because they looked interesting. The buildings felt older here, like they'd been watching people's stories unfold for centuries. She passed cafes filled with strangers' laughter and market stalls bursting with colors so vivid they seemed to hum in the sunlight. She stopped for coffee at a little street-side cafe. No one rushed her. The waiter smiled, not the kind of polite, obligatory smile she was used to, but a real one, like he was happy she existed in that moment. She didn't feel invisible here. She didn't feel like someone people glanced at, then looked away from. She felt seen. Not for how she looked, but simply because she was there. For hours, she sat there. She watched people rush by, couples holding hands, friends laughing, old men arguing good-naturedly over a game of cards. She didn't check the time. She didn't wonder what her husband was doing or whether her kids remembered to clean their rooms. She let her mind wander, untangling thoughts that had been knotted up for too long. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't thinking about her body. She wasn't wondering how she looked from the side, or whether her shirt clung in the wrong places, or if anyone noticed the extra weight around her middle. She wasn't sucking in her stomach or tugging her clothes into place. Her mind was quiet, free. She ate when she felt hungry, not when the clock said it was mealtime. She tried food that looked interesting, not what seemed healthiest. One night, she ordered a dessert without hesitation, a warm, syrupy pastry that reminded her of the sweets her grandmother used to make when she was a child. Each bite was a rebellion against the voice in her head that asked, "Do you really need this?" No one judged her for it. More importantly, she didn't judge herself. Somewhere along the way, she stopped thinking about her body as a problem to solve. It wasn't a weight loss journey. It was a weight letting go journey, shedding the invisible burdens she didn't realize she had been carrying. The weight of expectations. The weight of shoulds and shouldn'ts. The weight of feeling like her worth was tangled up in the shape of her body. She noticed something else, too. She was smiling more. Not the polite, half smile she gave acquaintances or the weary smile she gave her husband when he asked what was wrong and she said nothing. This was different. It was the kind of smile that bubbled up from somewhere deep inside, somewhere that hadn't seen daylight in a long, long time. She laughed, really laughed, and it felt like rediscovering a part of herself she thought was lost. By the third day, something strange happened. She caught her reflection in a shop window and didn't look away. For years, she'd trained herself to avoid mirrors. She dressed in a hurry, glancing at herself just long enough to make sure everything was covered. But now, she paused. She looked. She didn't see the extra weight or the lines around her eyes. She didn't zero in on the imperfections. She saw herself, really saw herself, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she liked what she saw. Not because her body had changed. It hadn't. But because the way she carried it had. She stood taller, not because she felt thinner, but because she felt lighter. She walked easier, not because she'd lost weight, but because she wasn't carrying everyone else's expectations anymore. She looked like a woman who knew who she was. And she loved her. She wasn't trying to become someone else anymore. She was finally becoming herself again. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling long after he had fallen asleep. His words replayed in her mind, not loud, but persistent, like the hum of an old refrigerator you stop noticing until the room goes quiet. She thought about all the times she had laughed off his comments before, the way she swallowed the sting and told herself he meant well. But this time felt different. This time, something inside her refused to let it go. She wasn't sure when it happened, when she had stopped recognizing the woman in the mirror. She used to love getting ready in the morning, picking out clothes, doing her hair. Now, it felt like a chore. She'd pull on whatever fit, twist her hair into a quick bun, and avoid meeting her own eyes. Somewhere between raising children, managing a household, and supporting her husband's career, she had faded into the background. She wasn't unhappy, not exactly. But she wasn't herself, either. Lying there in the quiet darkness, she remembered a time when she had dreamed of more. When she was younger, before marriage, before life got so predictable. She dreamed of seeing the world, of walking cobblestone streets in old European towns, feeling the sun on her skin by the sea, wandering through bustling marketplaces full of colors and life and noise. Those dreams had gotten smaller over time, traded for practical things like stability and responsibility. His comment, unintentionally cruel, sparked something. Not anger, not yet. But a need. A need to remind herself who she was beneath the roles of wife and mother, beneath the weight of everyone's expectations. She didn't want to go on a vacation to lose weight. She wanted to go to find herself again. So the next morning, before doubt could settle in, she did something she hadn't done in years. She made a decision purely for herself. She opened her laptop, browsed flights and hotels, and booked a trip. Alone. It wasn't impulsive, not really. It felt inevitable, like a truth she had been avoiding for too long. She chose a place that spoke to her soul, not to a travel guide. Somewhere vibrant and alive, where no one knew her as a wife or a mother, where she wasn't anyone's anything. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't even tell him right away. For once, she wasn't looking for validation or approval. This wasn't about proving a point or teaching him a lesson. It wasn't even about him anymore. This was about her. The day she returned home felt different from the day she left, though nothing around her seemed to have changed. The streets looked the same, the house still held that familiar smell of lived-in comfort, and her husband greeted her with a smile that seemed unsure, as though he wasn't sure which version of her had walked through the door. But something had shifted. She had changed. Not in the way he might have expected. She wasn't thinner or more polished or dressed differently. She hadn't returned as some dramatic, made-over version of the woman he thought she should be. The change was quieter, deeper, and more permanent than that. She moved through the house with a lightness that wasn't about weight but about freedom. There was no urgency in her steps, no invisible checklist running through her mind. She didn't rush to unpack or sort laundry or jump back into the rhythm of taking care of everyone else. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel guilty about putting herself first. Her husband noticed it immediately, though he couldn't quite name what felt different. He asked about her trip, and she told him, but not in the usual, edited way where she left out the parts that might make him uncomfortable. She didn't sugarcoat the truth. She told him about wandering through markets alone, about the cafe where no one rushed her, about the dessert that made her feel like a child again. She talked about how it felt to walk without sucking in her stomach, how she hadn't thought about her body for days, how good that felt. She watched his face as she spoke. She could see him processing it all, trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the one he thought he knew so well. For years, he had loved her, but he had loved her the way a man loves something he assumes will always be there. He loved her for her reliability, for the comfort she gave him, for the way she made his life easier without ever asking for much in return. He had loved her the way men are taught to love women, as though love is a thing you possess, rather than something you nurture. Now, though, he was starting to realize he didn't recognize this version of her, the one who seemed untethered from his approval. She wasn't waiting for him to compliment her, to notice her, to validate her. She didn't need him to. For the first time, he looked at her and felt something unexpected, fear. Not fear of losing her, not in the physical sense. But fear that maybe, without ever meaning to, he had lost a part of her already. He realized how long he had taken her for granted, how many times he'd spoken without thinking, never imagining his words might linger in her mind long after he'd forgotten them. He wondered how many times he'd mistaken her silence for acceptance. That night, as they lay in bed, the distance between them felt bigger than the mattress. He reached for her hand, something he hadn't done in a long time. She didn't pull away. But she didn't cling to him, either. They lay there in the quiet, and for the first time in their marriage, he understood that loving her wasn't enough. She needed to feel loved, not for how she looked, not for what she did for him or for their family, but for who she was. The woman she had found again on that trip. The woman she wasn't going to let disappear again. And for the first time, he was afraid she might not need him the way she once did. What scared him most wasn't that she might leave. It was that she might stay, but stop loving him back. And as he held her hand, unsure of what to say or how to fix what he never realized was broken, he knew one thing for certain: the woman lying next to him wasn't the same woman who had left. She was stronger now. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he deserved her.